So she wrote The Able Life of Cody Jane, Still Celebrating. And she'll present her topic today as the best thing that ever happened to me, discussing the possibilities for a full and joyful, able life in the face of the very real challenges and barriers faced by those with disabilities, and how the hardest assignments in life can lead to the greatest joy. Without further ado, Marley Cornell.
You guys, yes. Can you hear me? Yes. If anybody has trouble hearing me at any point, raise your hand, okay? I am really happy to be here. I welcome all of you. When I was invited to speak in a spiritual community, the first thing I did was say a prayer that God would help me say something that would be of use to whoever showed up. And the second thing I did was I invited angels to join me for support and help as well. And so I welcome all of those angels. I welcome each of you and all the angels that no doubt came in with each of you. I'm here to talk about the best thing that ever happened to me, which was knowing my daughter, Cody. And by extension, what makes an able life? A full life with joy and celebration. So the first thing I want to ask each of you is, raise your hand if you know someone in a wheelchair, or who has a chronic medical illness or condition, or if you yourself have one of these things. I would be surprised if there was anybody here who doesn't know someone like that. I worked in healthcare a long time, and there is a term used now in rehabilitation services called temporarily abled. Those of us who don't currently experience a disability will probably, if we live long enough, experience one, at least one. And so it really pays, it behooves all of us to learn how to best approach that type of challenge, barrier, or difficulty in life, and to make sure that we live with joy, resilience, and celebration, especially celebration. Everything I know about the topic of an able life, I learned from my daughter, Cody. She was born in 1972 with the most severe form of a congenital birth defect called Spina Bifida myelomeningocele. Because of it, she was paralyzed from the waist down. She had a shunt in her brain that had to be updated periodically throughout her life. She had a spinal fusion. She had a number of other medical challenges. She lived to be 32. But I'm here not to tell you a sad story. This is a joyful story because Cody lived a very full life. She had school, family, love. She helped others. She was an advocate. She was a social justice activist. She had a huge extended family. She ended up meeting a partner for life and experiencing marriage, although not in the legal sense. She was an advocate for the underdog in all situations. She lived independently in her own apartment when she was an adult. But I will say about Cody that she was not a person who wanted to be anything other than an ordinary person. She strove all her life to be just ordinary. She didn't want special treatment. She didn't want any pity. In fact, she was always looking for books that were written where the characters in the books had physical disabilities, but were just ordinary people. Really hard to find. And so we talked about it in her lifetime. We talked about maybe she should be the one to write such a book about her life. And she said something to me one day when we were talking about that. I said, hey, look, I'm a manuscript editor. I can help with this. And she said, Mom, who would be interested in some book about a woman who's had a lot of surgeries and junk? So she thought maybe she'd write a children's book, but in the end, she didn't end up writing a book, but I did. So what I'm about to do is tell you a few stories that illustrate the characteristics of an able life that I learned from her by her example. And I want to throw in a little disclaimer right now that I'm no expert on parenting. I was a pretty ordinary, average parent who did the best I could, like most parents. I know I made tons and tons of mistakes. I was extremely grateful for all the help I had along the way. I had, and a lot of that help was seen and some of it was unseen. We experienced a lot of miracles in Cody's life, and I'll explain a few of them. When I decided to write a book about her life, the first thing I did again was to say a prayer that God, please help me to write the book. And I asked Cody to please help me write the book. I had a lot of experience communicating with Cody. I appreciate the Catholic concept of the communion of saints that assures us that we are still in touch with our loved ones after they've passed on. And I have had many experiences having conversations with Cody and feeling her responses. And one of the ways I always know is something I call angel shivers, is when you get those goosebumps up and down your body and you go, yes. And whenever those happen to me, I always pay special attention. Somebody's telling me something. And sometimes I'll ask a second question, is that you, angels? And I'll get a I imagine other people have had this experience. So anyway, I had a lot of help. As I said, I had a lot of help along the way with Cody, seen and unseen. She had a huge family. She loved telling people about that she had 3 dads. Even though I had a couple of divorces, our family just kept getting bigger. And Cody was the great connector of all these people. She loved having lots more grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. So the first thing I want to tell you about is the first day I met Cody. I'm going to read 2 paragraphs from my book because I'm far more articulate as an editor in writing than I am when I'm talking off the cuff. So this was the day I met Cody. Sedation during childbirth was customary in standard hospitals in Philadelphia in 1972. So Tad and I chose a maternity center where natural childbirth was allowed. When Cody was a small child, she never tired of hearing the story of her first few moments and the way we met. My first look at her was in an envelope of, uh-oh. Cody emerged quietly on a Sunday morning in late August after 6 hours of labor. The doctor cautioned not to touch the baby's lower back as the midwife carefully placed the 5-pound, 8.5-ounce newborn on my stomach. The physician told me at once that my baby had a congenital birth defect called Spina Bifida. I asked what that meant. He said he'd get more information right away. For now, he knew she might be paralyzed or brain damaged. He paused before adding, she might not live. He again instructed me not to touch the dime-sized pink membrane visible on the middle of her lower back. While I looked down at this pale-skinned baby lying on my stomach, she was wide awake and calm. Her dark blue eyes peered up towards my face. I reached for her hand, and she grabbed my thumb. I was startled by the strength of her grip. So despite what the doctor had just said, I could see my kid was okay. From that moment on, Tad and I knew that whatever physical problems she might have, Cody was fine. The biggest thing I know, some people have had this experience in life where something happens to them that you remember for the rest of your life is like a cleaver popping down that divides everything that happened before with everything that happened after. Well, that didn't happen the day my daughter was born. That was still part of my magical, in a way, childhood. I was a 22-year-old young American woman who had never experienced too much tragedy in life. My family was fairly okay, financially, and I had what I needed, and I knew there was suffering in the world, but it was usually pretty far away, though the Vietnam War was winding down at that point. And I had had maybe a few deaths in the family, some grandparents and a couple of friends, but I don't think I understood very well too much about real suffering. What I learned about that happened the very next day after Cody was born. My husband Tad and I were allowed to go down to the Thomas Jefferson University Hospital neonatal intensive care unit, and that was where Cody had been rushed soon after her birth for the first of many surgeries in her life to close the opening on the base of her spine and watch to see if she would need a shunt in her brain, which she ultimately did. So we go down to this hospital and go into this neonatal intensive care nursery, and I want to describe it for you because I walk into a long room, a long sort of hallway, and it was all glass. In those days, you couldn't touch your kid, be near your kid if they were in an intensive care unit. So we could only look through the glass. But before I got to the far end of the hallway where my own daughter was able to be seen through the glass, the nurse who was accompanying us was pointing out various other children that were in these small little baskets, these little bassinets lined up with plastic with the child's name on them. And I looked down, and the first child I looked at was just a tiny, tiny little baby. The nurse explained that this little boy had just been born in the last hour and a half, and that he was being prepared, or that a surgery operation room was being prepared, and a team was being assembled to do a surgery on this boy because his heart, he had been born with it on the outside of his chest. And I looked down at this kid, and I see this heart, this tiny little heart, and it's throbbing, it's beating. I looked at that and I was dumbfounded. How is this even possible? The little child looked peaceful and sleeping. And the nurse said he would be going into surgery, and we moved on to the next little child, and she pointed out a little girl who said had been born with her esophagus not attached to her stomach, and she would be having surgery soon to reattach everything in her body and put it in the right place. We went down the row. There was another child that had been born with Spina Bifida who had been there for a while, and whose parents, when the child was born, had been overwhelmed at the thought that their child was born with something wrong with it. And so they had gone home and said, I don't want my child. You take care of it. Happily, that little child, I learned, was adopted by one of the loving nurses. The nurses in these places were just awesome people, very loving. So the thought that came to me as I'm looking at all these children, and when I finally see my own sweet kid lying there looking all pink and rosy in her sleep with her little fists up next to her face, was this was a part of the world, that a part of life and a part of existence that I didn't know existed before. It had never touched me this closely before. I had never experienced anything like people I know who came out of the killing fields, or who lived through war-torn Bosnia, or Afghanistan or Iraq, and some of the things that are going on today. And so to me, I immediately had this image that this one neonatal intensive care unit was just one of many, many, many of these types of places all over Philadelphia, all over Pennsylvania, all over other states, and all over other countries. And so it just struck me there's a lot of this kind of challenge and suffering in the world. And the feeling that came to me was one of profound gratitude, because if this was the reality, then I wanted to be aware of it. I wanted to be part of trying to fix it, being a part of making a difference. And so, to me, my husband Tad and I both had the same reaction. We were just handed a very important assignment in life. We were handed one of these kids, and that we knew things were going to be difficult, things were going to be complex and challenging, but we also felt special because we had just been given a real important assignment. And so that's how we took taking care of our daughter. And for the next 6 weeks while she was in the hospital, we spent every day visiting with her and finding an apartment that would be local, that would be near the hospitals, that she would end up needing quite a bit of involvement with throughout her life. So each day we'd come in and we'd say, when can we take her home? We want her home. So finally at 6 weeks, we were allowed to bring her home. So Cody was lying in a little bassinet asleep in the car, and we get to our little house, our little apartment, and Tad is walking ahead of me as I'm carrying this little kid, and I look down, and Cody had turned blue. My heart leapt into my throat, and my first reaction was, God, help! And in the split second that it took Tad to rush to my side, we both looked down and saw Cody go from being totally blue to being rosy and pink, and she smiled in her sleep. That day was the first miracle of many, many, many miracles in my life, and it was with regard to Cody, that reaffirmed for me that we were getting some help, that we had unseen helpers who were paying attention, that God cared about our kid, God cared about us. Now, at that time, we had been brought up in Christian households. My parents were Presbyterian, Tad's parents were Catholic. But we were members of we were loosely associated with the Self-Realization Fellowship. We had read the autobiography of a yogi with Paramahansa Yogananda. And so we wrote letters to the Self-Realization Fellowship and asked them to please start praying for Cody, that we wanted all the forces of good in the universe focused on making her life good and happy and full. So now I want to fast forward to Cody's 2.5 years old. Tad and I decided, since we were stuck going to a lot of doctor's appointments and a lot of hospitals and a lot of things that weren't really fun for a little kid, we were going to try and inject as much joy and happiness and fun into Cody's life as possible. One of the helpers along the way with her that helped us a great deal was our 2 beagles, Mort and Sadie. Cody was fascinated with dogs, and she spent every minute in their company at home, and she loved to reach out and try and touch them. She learned how to roll over. She learned how to lift up. She learned a lot of physical agility, dragging herself around by her upper body by paying attention to these dogs and trying to follow them around. They adored her and they protected her, and often I found them sleeping in a pile together. Well, when she was about 2.5, we had found a little house in the outer ring of the suburbs of Philadelphia where there was a carpeted staircase. And in the morning, when we would get up, Cody would go shooting out into the hallway, and she wanted to follow the dogs down the stairs. So I said to her, hang on. If you're going to go down the stairs, I want to teach you how to do this right. And so we spent a couple weeks practicing, and I showed her how she could, on her belly, go down the stairs carefully, holding onto the balusters, one by one, and get to the bottom of the stairs. So it's a huge accomplishment for her. It was like a physical therapy thing as well. So she got really good at it. And I'll tell you what happened one night when we had some company. I called out to Cody to come downstairs and meet our guests. She had mastered the method of descending the carpeted staircase on her belly like an alligator. She did it so fast, she sometimes alarmed people who thought she was falling down the stairs. Cody loved to meet new people. She rushed to the bottom of the stairs, gave our friends a wide smile, raised her fist in the air, and declared, "Baby power." Now I'll forward a little bit. I'm hoping each story is illustrating a particular thing about an able life. One of the important things I think about an able life is humor. You got to find the fun in things. And Cody was one of the funniest people. She's probably the funniest person I ever knew. She always found humor in the most devastating, tragic situations, and not at others' expenses either. It was just pure and simple funny. When she was 5, I was about to remarry, and she came along for the blood test required by the Pennsylvania license application. Now, she'd been through a ton of medical stuff. I'd always been healthy, never had a single thing wrong with me. So she comes along with me. I'll read you this. She carried a large pocketbook that Mima Cornell had given her. And I teased Cody, and I said, I was a little scared of this blood test. To the old pro, I'm saying this. She said to me, "Don't worry, Mom, I'm here." Then she added in a consoling tone as I went in for the test, "If you're good, I'll give you something from my purse." When I returned to the waiting room, Cody said gently, "See, you're okay. It's over now. Do you want someone to talk to?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, come here then." And she motioned me towards her. I sat down in front of Cody and looked at her cherubic smile and twinkling eyes as her arm thrust out. She dropped a tiny wooden Weeble doll in my hand and said, "Talk to this." Now I want to fast forward another 10 years. Cody's 15 years old. She is, she's had a lot more surgeries. Her spine's been fused through a series of 6 surgeries to get that done. She had a lot of emergencies. We'd ended up in the hospital. Whenever her shunt would break down, that was the most threatening thing that could happen to her. When a shunt breaks down, it enlarges the ventricles in your brain with pressure from intracranial fluid. And at worst come to worst, if you have spina bifida and you have what Cody had called an Arnold-Chiari syndrome, pressure on that part of her brain could stop her involuntary brain functions, breathing, heartbeat, hearing, seeing, things like that. So that's why whenever she had these symptoms, we rushed straight to the hospital and made sure neurosurgeons were seeing her immediately. And I had spent many a night, all night, in an emergency room dealing with stuff like this. So at 15, we had just been back to Philadelphia. I now lived here in Minnesota, in South Minneapolis. And we come back, and Cody, we had been visiting relatives, and she started having some of the symptoms. Terrible headache, her eyes weren't able to look up, things like that. So we go to the St. Paul Children's Hospital, and the neurosurgeon comes in the middle of the night and checks her out, and he says, her ventricles, the CAT scan shows they're expanded, but I'm just hesitant to do surgery. I'm just not sure we need it. Let's see if it clears itself on its own, because sometimes debris would get caught in the shunt and it could maybe move along. So that was what his hope was. And so I had spent that first night with her. Well, the next day, the ventricles hadn't gotten any bigger. And so the guy was still hesitant. He said, let's watch her one more day. Well, I was in a panic about that. I was in a panic about that. As a mom, I'm very scared that the worst thing was going to happen. I have to confess at this point something that, despite the fact that I believe in God and angels and help and miracles, fear and faith have always been an ongoing struggle for me. Fear is one of those things that has always been a challenge. And I learned recently, I was reading a book about Gandhi, that I'm in good company, because he spent most of his life being very frightened. And he had a mantra, Rama, 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 God's name, that he said again and again throughout his life, just when he was eating. It was the last thing he said when he died. So, got myself off there. I'm about to describe a miracle in the midst of fear. So, that second night, my husband Dennis spent with Cody. We had always, we never left Cody alone in the hospital overnight. Hospitals are scary, dangerous places, and everybody needs an advocate, especially a child or anyone who's vulnerable. And so he spent that night, and I went home to take care of the dogs. And the neurosurgeon had made an order that every 2 hours a nurse would come in and check Cody's vital signs, do what they called a Neuro Check, shine a little light in her eyes, make sure you can see through the irises of the eyes, you can see if there's intracranial pressure on the optic nerve. And so they were doing that. And Dennis would wake up. He was sleeping on the parent cot next to the bed, and he would wake up when the nurse would come in. It's hard to sleep in a hospital. And then he'd roll over and go back to sleep. Well, in this particular moment, sometime in the middle of the night, the nurse came in and did a Neuro Check and then left. Cody was fine. Dennis rolled over to go to sleep. And in about 90 seconds, he suddenly felt, now he never described it as a tap on his shoulder. I think of it metaphorically as a tap on his shoulder. Suddenly he felt like, look at Cody. And he looked over at her. She had stopped breathing. And so he immediately yells for doctors, and a code was called, and the room filled with experts, and the revival process was put in place, and Cody was eventually put on a respirator, and she was revived and moved into a different unit where she was given lots of monitors, and she remained on a respirator although she was conscious. So this, of course, was a pretty scary thing for me. I wasn't home, I wasn't with her when this happened. I go rushing to the hospital. It was a cold winter night in January. But in a conversation with my brother, he pointed out, yeah, but did you notice the miracle there? The fact that Dennis woke up and looked over just when he did, so my abject terror that I was sort of carrying with me sort of relaxed a little bit, because I thought, you're right, we're being taken care of. This is just damn scary. So we go to the hospital, and that was the first thing. Well, then Cody ends up, over the next several days, finally, she was on the respirator but conscious, not a good, comfortable way to be.
And what we learned right away, because she was on the respirator, I got one of those like whiteboard things where you could write numbers and letters and she could communicate with us. And she kept turning her head like this. What we didn't know at the time was the pressure on the optic nerve had rendered her blind. She only had peripheral vision anymore. And so she was turning her head to point to the letters, which she painstakingly spelled out, "Get me out of here." So anyway, she recovered from the surgery, the respirator was taken off, and the next step was to go, we were meeting with a neurosurgeon, and Cody was kind of ticked off. She was like, "Why did this happen? Why can't I see? What's going on? Have you ever seen this happen before?" And the doctor was kind of chagrined, and he's going, "This isn't typical. I don't know how to explain it, but I will tell you that I'll get you the best experts." And Cody said, "That's what I want, the best eye doctor." So he refers us to an eye doctor who he says is the best and is in St. Paul or Maplewood or somewhere. So we get the first appointment we can get, which is in a couple of days, and we go to see this guy. So he does a complete review of everything going on in with Cody's eyes, drops and machines looking at it and that kind of thing. And when he's done, Cody's sitting there in her wheelchair, and Dennis and I are sitting sort of in a circle with the doctor. And the doctor looks really depressed. And he says, "Well, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but Cody is blind. She's legally blind, and all of her central vision is gone. She has a little peripheral vision, and that's it. We don't know if this is the extent of the damage or if it'll get worse." He says, "But I'll tell you, it's not likely to get better. If it gets better, you won't see any improvement for 6 to 9 months, maybe a year. But I don't want to make you, give you false hope or suggest that you should expect this." Well, Dennis and I are looking at, Cody's just sitting in her chair, and Dennis and I look over at each other like, how can this be? This is just, this kid has enough stuff to deal with in her life. She's going to be blind on top of it? This is just untenable. This is, this is the conversation going on inside my head. Obviously, I'm not going to say this out loud to my kid, but I'm like, how is this possible? This is the epitome of unfairness, and this is awful. And Dennis, by his facial expression, I can see us having similar thoughts, and we shared later, we both did. Before either of us could say a single thing, Cody speaks. She said, "Mom, my friend Orlando is legally blind, and he does his homework and gets books on tape. I could do my homework with him from now on." And so Dennis and I both go, who are we to respond with the negativity and the loss of hope and all this sort of thing when her natural reaction was resilient and hopeful and joyful, and she thought of a cute guy she wanted to do her homework with. So that's another example of not just miracles. Prayer works, miracle works, but the miracles happen. God cares about us. But resilience is one of those key factors that anybody, each of us, would do well to nurture in our lives. Now, I didn't always remember the lessons that I learned from Cody as the years went by, so I want to fast forward another 10 years. She's in her 20s. She's living in her own apartment. I'm now married to my husband, Ernie, who I've been with for 20 years. And Cody has a personal care attendant that comes a couple hours each day. And she's helping people. She's someone who's contributing to her environment and remaining involved in social justice causes and that sort of thing. But taking care of her physical body has become more and more complicated as the older she gets. And at one point, she's transferring from her wheelchair onto her bed, and an accident occurs. One of the little toes on one of her feet is almost torn off. Now, she didn't feel it. She was paralyzed from the waist down, and so she didn't know what had happened. It took until the next day when her personal care attendant noticed a little blood on her sock that this had even occurred. And so this ended up getting complicated and getting an infection, and it didn't get better, and she ended up having to have her toe amputated. Well, this did not sit well with Cody because she liked wearing sandals, and she said, "I'll never wear sandals again. This sucks." And, you know, I felt really bad for her. I was, at the time, working full-time in a hospital, and I was feeling just awful for her because the same week, her favorite attendant, someone she had been close friends with and who had traveled with her and gone on airplanes with her to visit family and stuff, was now moving on in her career and was no longer going to be a personal care attendant. This is a huge loss. It's so hard for people with disabilities to have attendants that are really, truly trustworthy and then on top of it, good friends. So this was a big loss. And also, a guy she had a crush on had moved out of the building. The apartment she was living in, she was the first person to live there. She moved in 1991. The Americans with Disability Act was passed in 1990. And as a result, some new apartment buildings were cropping up here and there, and that's why she was able to move into her own apartment, to a place that was almost completely wheelchair accessible. And so I decided, given how bad I was feeling about Cody and how depressed she must be, I wanted to go over to her house and on the way home from work and bring her a gift. So I stopped at a store and bought her something, I don't remember what, and I showed up at her house, or at her apartment, and I come in and thinking, oh, my poor kid, poor honey, I'll hug her and kiss her and all this. And I walk in and I find out immediately how I had completely underestimated her resilience. I walk into the room and Cody is sitting at her kitchen table. The kitchen table is covered with her craft items. Her right foot is up on the extended wheelchair thing with the bandage on it. And she's sculpting. And I look down and I go, what is that? She had sculpted an exact replica of her toe. And it really looked real. It was absolutely disgusting. She said, and she said, I said, what are you doing? That looks so gross. That's real looking. Looks like your toe. And she says, I know. And she holds up this little vial, one of those test tubes, and she had placed the label from her surgery the previous day. It had her name on it. She says, I'm going to put it in this vial and send it to Dad in Hawaii. He was on her second dad number two was an academic, and he was on sabbatical in Hawaii that year teaching. She said, I'm going to send it to Dad with this note. And I pick up the note, and it said, since you can't be here with me, I'm sending a little bit of me to be with you. The other thing was Cody hated being in the hospital, of course, and a lot of her surgeries, even a brain surgery one time, she was able to go home the same day afterwards. She had a way of convincing people to give her a break and let her go. But when she was 25, she developed some severe pressure wounds that caused her to be in a rehab center of a hospital for 3 full weeks. Now, she had been in the hospital many, many times for short stays, but this was a long one, and she wasn't thrilled about that idea. And so she ended up Ernie and I would alternate. Both of us were working full time at the time, so neither of us could actually spend the night with her, and which during emergencies we always did. But in this particular case, she was pretty safe. She was totally in control of her own ability to advocate for herself, and so we would hang out with her in the evenings, but during the day we would alternate which day we'd stop by and have lunch with her during work. And while we were there one time, we were told, somebody came in and said, you know, Cody, you could have a spiritual advisor here if you want. And Cody said, good, I'd like that. And they said, well, would you like a priest, a rabbi, or a minister? And she said, all three. So every day while she was there, she had at least 3 more visitors. Now, my husband, Ernie, is a software developer, and so having always known a lot about computers, he always made sure that Cody had the most workable and best computer that she could have. He'd upgrade it every couple of years and give her the ability to stay connected. The internet is a huge equalizer for everyone, really, but particularly for people with disabilities who don't necessarily have access to other places in the world or can get in and out to everywhere they want to go, or are sometimes judged unfairly by physical looks and that kind of thing, and so they can meet people on the internet. Cody taught us about chat rooms. We didn't know about them. And she was involved in a number of chat rooms where the people in the chat rooms were people with various disabilities from around the world who would share stories and tell each other things. And it was a huge advantage if you're going to have a certain kind of surgery or something. You say, did you ever have one of these? And they'd share medication after effects, all kinds of stuff like that. And so Ernie had also warned Cody to be very safe. Don't give away your personal information. And so she was very smart about about her interactions on the internet, and never had a dangerous situation. But because of that, she ended up meeting a few guys sometimes, and she did date a couple of them. And the most important one was her partner for life, John, who's here with us today, and today is his birthday. And when she met him, he lived in Oakland, California, and somehow they ended up falling in love, and he started visiting Cody and staying 2 or 3 weeks at a time. The amount of time he stayed started getting a lot longer than the amount of time he was gone, and pretty soon he made the jump and he moved here. And so on the 4th of July, 2003, Cody and John became partners for life. They had a big commitment ceremony. They called it Interdependence Day. Now, often people with disabilities would suffer some disadvantages by legal marriage due to our laws that prevent the amount of money you have in your bank account and that kind of thing if you're receiving any kind of disability services, and both of them were. So this was a religious ceremony, a spiritual ceremony, and a family ceremony. And it was fabulous. All of Cody's parents were there, all her 3 dads were there. Everybody came from around. John's family and friends came from California. Her cousins and parents, everybody came from all around the country. We had about 65 or 70 people there, I think. They were all relatives and friends from around the country. So, Gary, if you can turn on the pictures. When I wrote the book about Cody's life, people have told me they wish they knew what she looked like. So my friend Marshall Davis from Davistown put together a list of, a minute and a half of pictures of Cody so you can see what she looked like through her life and see some of her family members.
She was my flower girl. I forgot to tell you something really important in terms of miracles with regard to Cody with her eyes. I didn't say that, did I? When 3 weeks after Cody came home from the hospital and she had gone blind, we went back to see the same eye doctor, and he examined her. And we had learned in that 3 weeks how Cody could maneuver school and do her homework and that sort of thing. And when the eye doctor did the follow-up 3.5 weeks after the first one, he finished his examination and he turned around and he says, I don't know how to explain this, but Cody's vision's 100%. He says, I just don't get it. The damage was so extensive. It was so severe, and there is no medical explanation for what happened. And so Cody, meanwhile, smiling because she was, she had apparently had regained this vision but hadn't bothered to mention it to us. But soon after she came home from the hospital, I had contacted family members of mine. I have a mother who at the time was a crisis line phone answering person who led prayer groups at her house every Friday night, and who was connected to a lot of people on throughout the country on prayer chains. And I had said, would you please add Cody to your list and get people everywhere praying for her? And then I also have a brother who lives in St. Louis who belonged to a faith healing group. And I asked him to please mobilize his forces. So in the end, we were not real surprised that Cody regained her vision. And when she's smiling and and the doctor is just looking and scratching his head, I said, I think I know what happened. And I told him, I said, you know, people have been praying for Cody. And when I say people, I mean hundreds of people have been praying for Cody's eyesight in the last 3.5 weeks. And the doctor, now when you talk about faith healing and prayers and miracles with doctors, they're not quick usually, in my experience, to agree that that was a possibility. But this guy goes, I'm with you here. That's what it had to be what happened, because there is no medical explanation for this. So I guess what I want to leave you with today is the thought, I hope these examples have given you examples of fun, humor, resilience, helping other people, being an advocate, having a lot of joy in your life, and approaching everything with celebration. Cody always found something to celebrate about. Her birthday was always a big deal, and not necessarily to give attention to her. I would sometimes at my office get a big bouquet of flowers that would be from Cody saying, congratulations on the birth of your daughter. So in the end, life is a tough haul for everybody, and so these features are really worthwhile for all of us to adopt. Helen Keller was born blind and deaf, and her viewpoint was one Cody would agree with. Life is a daring adventure. So I thank everybody for being here today. I thank all the angels that have helped around today, and I wish all of you many blessings and many angel shivers. Thank you.